cover a necessary clause also, or something, that elastic clause? Yes.
Okay, you guys ready? All right, here we go. All right. Okay, so we've got the, I think we covered this one before. Declaration of war. Michael, who has the power to declare war? Two choices, the president or Congress? And it is in Article 1, Section 8, so make sure you have that. I think you did from before. Congress has the power to declare war. So why are you feeling like the president has something to do with like the operation of the military in wartime? As it turns out, this is where it gets a little confusing. Make sure you have this in your notes, and you'll have it again when we get to the official powers of the presidency. The president is the commander-in-chief, is in charge day to day of the operations of the military. Okay? So if we get into a warlike situation, who's going to be responsible for the troops? The president. Could they sometimes be not on the same page? Yeah. But the basic thing is this, and this is where last time I'm going to reemphasize this again. Literally the last time our country was declaring war was in World War II. That was the last time. It was President number 32, Franklin D. Roosevelt. He went to Congress and asked Congress to declare war against Japan, because Japan had attacked our country on December 7th, 1941. And Roosevelt's like, yeah, I'm going to ask Congress to do what I think Congress is going to do already, which is vote for a declaration of war. And they did. And then Germany declared war on us. Stupid Germany. Stupid Hitler. And we're like, you want to declare war on us? Fine, we'll declare war on you. We'll beat, boom, Japan, and boom, Germany and Italy. But have we had other wars since that time? Yeah, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. We've been at war in other times. But put this down. It's interesting. You don't necessarily get official declarations of war, but Congress typically then would pass a joint resolution, because joint resolutions take place in the House and the Senate. You need both. And they would support the president to use military force in the Korean situation for the Korean War, the Vietnamese situation for the Vietnam War. We have troops fighting in Afghanistan today. Did Congress authorize that? Yes. Okay? You're really on shaky ground if you're the president and you're like, I'm not going to bother going into Congress to ask for help, to support a war. Because that's not smart. Because you know who has the power to unfund your military to fight in a particular area? That would be Congress. Congress has the power of the purse, the power of the funding mechanisms. Do you got that? So we usually try to keep it on the same page. Probably the best example I can come up with where there was a difference of opinion, look at President number 38, Gerald R. Ford. Okay, here's the story. 1970, was it 1975? I think it was 1975. President Ford was like, oh no, we got a message from South Vietnam. They were just being invaded by North Vietnam. What? North Vietnam? Just 2 years earlier, you signed a treaty which said you wouldn't invade South Vietnam. And the United States signed that treaty too. And you know what we did as part of that treaty? We pulled all our troops out. Because we're like, well, North Vietnam promised not to attack anymore, so we pulled our troops out. And we also made a promise to South Vietnam that if North Vietnam ever attacked us, you know what we do? We get our troops back in there. That's what we said to South Vietnam. We get our troops back in there. So President Ford was like, I'm going to send the troops back in there. Well, as it turns out, we had been involved in a long Vietnam War, and the country, particularly the Congress, was like, sorry, President, not going to support you on that. So how many U.S. troops went back in there to fight against the North Vietnamese? 0. And what did North Vietnamese accomplish? Yeah, exactly. They conquered South Vietnam and made it one communist country called Vietnam. Exactly. Which the flag is right over there. On the lower right, one row up with a red background and the singular yellow star. That's the Vietnamese flag. That's the communist flag for North and South combined. What's that? Yeah, lower right. It's a little beat up there, but yeah. My flags are getting a little beat up. Yeah, it helps to be like way up at the top there where people, but Vera's been doing very well. Thank you, Vera. You're not like bumping your chair back into the flags or your backpack or anything like that. Thank you very much. All right, so we got the power of Congress to declare war, and we also have, write this down, the United States Constitution designates the creation of a national army and navy, which is very important. Did we have a national army and navy before the Congress Constitution created that? No, not really. I mean, we had basically all the different states had their component. We did have the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War, but then that was over after the Revolutionary War. But now we have the Army, the Navy, the Marines, which were around at the very beginning. The Air Force, the United States Air Force, was created from within the original Army. They were called the Army Air Corps, and then they were created as a separate military unit. By the way, let me throw this out to you. Do we need to amend the Constitution to have an Air Force? If the Constitution says we can have a Navy and an Army? I don't think so. This is one of those things, I'll jump ahead real quick. This is called the elastic clause. It's the last one in there, and we might as well go ahead and make some comments in your notes on this one already. Congress has the power to do what is necessary to carry out the other powers. They refer to that as the elastic clause, as in stretchy. It gives Congress, it gives the United States government a little bit of a stretch to make sure that it can do what it needs to do, and you don't have to be really, really stuck on the exact words of the Constitution. A good example of that is the military component in the Constitution. Doesn't speculate in Air Force, but I mean, could people fly back in the time the Constitution was written? No. Could people go up into space? No. And now we actually have, there it is, the United States Space Force, which is a new military component. It actually is based on components that were in the Air Force because they were handling some of the stuff in the way, way high atmosphere. So that's brand new. That's been around for like maybe just a year or so. Yeah, the Space Force. Although it was interesting when they came up with the logo, some people quickly noted that the logo is very, very similar to the fictional Starfleet Command, from which? Star Trek, exactly. Captain Kirk, exactly. There we go. Lieutenant Uhura, and that is, of course, Spock. Yep, you got that one down. Yeah, that's good. Can you do that? Can you make them go apart? Anyway, whatever. Okay. All right, and we have National Guard units. Put this down. National Guard units, also referred to as militia, state militia. You're like, what? A state militia group, like you had in the days of the American Revolution, those are organized within the state, but now we've got it very much kind of under the auspices of our national military. So we have, like in the state of Idaho, we have the Idaho Air National Guard, and they work very closely in cooperation with and basically are a part of the United States Air Force. Okay? So you got a lot of overlap there. Every once in a while, you will have, well, let's just put this down. Who, do you know who, Jana, is the head of the Idaho Air Guard? I'm not going to say no. Who in Idaho is the head of the Idaho Air National Guard? Who's the most important executive person in the state of Idaho? It's the governor, yeah. Who can step in and say, Governor, I need your guard units to go into action and help out as a National Guard, either fighting overseas or, I don't know, going to Washington, D.C. to make sure everything's cool there? And the answer, Jana, is the president. So write that down. The governor is the first line of authority on these militia units, National Guard units. But above that is the President of the United States. That actually came up in history because there were some Southern segregationist governors that were like, okay, we're going to use our National Guard units to prevent black kids from going to school with white kids. And then the president was like, yeah, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go ahead and federalize, nationalize these Guard units, and they're going to follow my orders. Okay, do you see that? It's kind of a weird little thing. So National Guard units, think of them as being kind of more in a part-time capacity. They serve the country, but they also, many of them, have part-time jobs as well, or regular jobs, I should say, and their National Guard is part-time service. Okay? Questions about that? It's all part of that defense component. Our United States government needs to make sure that we're going to have national security components, as well as domestic security. They can come in. I mean, they were stationed within the last year in Washington, D.C. Is that a national security challenge or a domestic security challenge? I think that's a domestic security challenge, and things got kind of like calmed down. January 6th was not a good day. They're still talking about it in Washington, D.C. right now. But January 20th, the inauguration, anything crazy going on that day? No, I think there was plenty of law enforcement provision, including a lot of National Guard unit troops from different parts of the country to maintain order. Okay? Now, here we go. This is an interesting component. The Constitution envisions the creation of the District of Columbia. Let me give you some details here. Okay? The District of Columbia. Look, it's square. This is national territory that was created for the purposes of a national capital city. Oh, the original capital city, let me see, the Declaration of Independence was done in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1776. George Washington took the oath of office as President of the United States and served out his first years in the city of New York. Yeah. But they decided, let's make sure, and they were in the process of putting this together, let's make sure we have a permanent capital city. And they located it, write this down, along the banks of the Potomac River in territory that was given over by the states of Maryland and Virginia. Write that down. Maryland and Virginia gave over some territory to the United States of America for the purpose of a national capital. District of Columbia, yeah. And then later they named it after George Washington. So the original District of Columbia, named after George Washington. The Maryland part and the Virginia part together make a perfect square. Why do you suppose, Vera, why do you suppose they chose our national capital in that geographic location, as opposed to further north or further south? If they had it further north, who wouldn't like that? It's okay. If they had it like way up in New York, who would be like, oh my gosh, it's way up in the north. That's such a pain. People living in the south, yeah. If they had it way down in the south, who would not be very happy about that? Exactly. So this is like a compromise. Put that down. This is like a compromise. As it turns out, at that time, some of you guys are like, let me see, Virginia, that was a slave state. Oh, and so was Maryland. They're both slave states. So did they have slavery in Washington, D.C.? Yeah, they did have slavery in Washington, D.C. Some of you guys might remember from last year, I think. Was I able to show that particular one? There was a movie called 12 Years a Slave about a northern African American who was a musician, and he got captured. He was fooled. Actually, he was given some like intoxicants, and he passed out, and then he was sold as a slave in the Deep South. That actually occurred while he was in Washington, D.C., and that was prior to the Civil War. That was really messed up. Okay? So, got this? So Washington, D.C., turns out, if you go right to the center of it, it's mostly in the Maryland part. And eventually, put this down, they didn't need the Virginia part so much, so they gave that back to Virginia. In fact, guess what? That's where I grew up. Look on this map. In this Virginia part right here, that's where I grew up. Right here where I'm pointing. This is Arlington, Virginia. This part of Arlington is the National Cemetery. Right down here, they built the Pentagon. So, this is for the quiz next Thursday. And then as soon as you're ready, you can do that one. Ooh, lovely. Okay, thank you. So, there we go. If you live in Washington, D.C., are you a U.S. citizen? If you were born in Washington, D.C., are you a U.S. citizen?
Yeah.
Yes. Do you get a vote for President of the United States?
Yeah.
Yes. In fact, you get a vote for President of the United States because we amended the Constitution, the 23rd Amendment. Since 1961, people living in Washington, D.C. get a vote for President of the United States. Do you get to vote for the United States Senate and the United States House of Representatives, voting members? No. So some of the people living in D.C. are like, wow, it's almost like I'm in a territory permanently. Yeah.
So it's not a state, it's like
It is the District of Columbia. It's like national territory for the purposes of, and most of like the official government things are like right in here. Like where I'm pointing right here, that would be the Washington Monument. Just north of that is the White House. Just east of that is the Capitol building. And if you were there, you can still see it's kind of green and so forth. There's lots of like Smithsonian museums and various different things and government office buildings. It's very, very important. How many of you guys have ever visited Washington, D.C.? Well, you got to the downtown part then, right? It's very beautiful. And they actually have rules there that say you can't build a building any higher than the Capitol building. Although across the water in Virginia, they've got some pretty tall buildings over there because the restriction doesn't apply. Questions with respect to Washington, D.C.? There's Arlington, where I grew up, Alexandria down there, and this main part, the donation from Maryland, is still Washington, D.C. So it's not square, perfectly square anymore. It's a funky shape. They are in Washington, D.C. Yep, that's what's going on. Okay, next, the necessary and proper clause. This is the last component of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8. And it basically is saying, look, anything that is necessary and proper to carry out one of the powers that is in the Constitution, we're going to allow it. Let me give you a good example. You ready? Does Congress have the authority to create a military? What do you think? Is it specifically listed in the Constitution? Where? Article 1, Section. What's the one we've been dealing with the last? Section 8, yeah, exactly. So, yeah, going back to this. Whoops, that one. So we've got the United States Constitution specifically says we got an army and we got a navy. All right? So we're like, hey, we got an army, we got a navy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we need people to join. So if you join, if you join as a volunteer, that's cool. Well, is there anything in the Constitution that says what happens if we don't have enough volunteers for the military? Let me deal with this real quick and then I'll call on you. This isn't too hard. What do you call it when you force somebody to be in the military? You can use a lottery, yeah? It's called a draft. Write it down. Military draft. Is there something in the Constitution that specifically allows for Congress to create conscription, a forced military draft? No, there's nothing specifically that says that. But would one argue that in order to have a military, if we don't get enough volunteers, it would be necessary and proper to create a draft? Sure, because otherwise you're not going to have enough people in it. I think that's a good example of stretching the Constitution a bit to allow for the government to carry out some of its powers. Sometimes it does get stretched quite a bit. That's why it's referred to as the elastic clause. Probably some of the things where it really, really super gets stretched is when they're like interpreting, like, what is interstate commerce and can they regulate it? Okay, back to your question.
Why does it say like court on the recording? How do you pronounce that? Like on the military symbol.
Corps.
Court?
The Marine Corps. You will sound very intelligent if you say Marine Corps instead of if you try to pronounce it phonetically. Because if you say corpse, somebody's going to look at you and like, yeah, you don't know what they're talking about.
Well, what does it mean? Like, we also use it for like other terms, right?
Like the Army Corps of Engineer, you see that on there? as well. I don't know, it's one of those weird English words where you've got a letter in there and you don't pronounce it. I don't know. It's a weird kind of a thing. Okay? Anybody know what the Marines actually did initially, back in the old days, like Pirates of the Caribbean and so forth? Those were the guys on the ships that carried the guns and were necessary in order to get into any fights. They weren't necessarily sailors. Modern Marine Corps could be doing all kinds of different things. During World War II, a lot of them left ships, landed on the beaches to fight Japanese forces that were defending those islands from U.S. attack. So Marine Corps, if you're looking for a part of the military that you're probably most guaranteed to get into a scrap, I would say Marine Corps and Army. Not as likely necessarily to get into a hand-to-hand kind of a fight situation if you're in the Air Force, Coast Guard, or the Navy. Okay? Questions, comments? Shall we go to section 2? Article 2? Showa! Yeah, let's do it. You go back up there and pull this one up. Article 2 of the United States Constitution deals with the executive branch, the presidency in particular. And let's go through all of the various different basics associated with that. And some of them, thankfully, we did, which is going to make it a little bit easier to understand how this plays out as we go into this. Okay? First, let me see, presidential, how do I have this like? Presidential basics. Yeah, president and vice presidential terms. Let's do that. Okay? President, there we go. What is the length of a term for the President of the United States of America? 4 years, very good. If President Trump had been reelected, he would have gotten 4 more years, combined total of 8. Okay? Does that make sense? What is the amount of time for a vice presidential term? 4 years. Very good. Okay, so they serve subsequent things. So was there a time, actually, this is a trick question, was there a time when President Trump was president and Kamala Harris was vice president? Yes.
Oh, yeah, because we get
Who was inaugurated first between Harris and Biden? Harris was, yeah. They always do the vice president first, and then right after that, then they do the president. So, I mean, technically there's a little bit of a time lapse on that. Okay? That, curiously, was changed by the 22nd Amendment. The 22nd Amendment, ratified in 1951, put the first ever limit on the number of years a president could serve. Okay, you're writing that down? Prior to that time, if you look at all these various different presidents and so forth, not one of them, except for one, served more than 8 years. You can write this down. President Washington was the first one. He served 2 consecutive terms of 4 years, and he basically said that should be enough. We don't want to have people serve way too long because that's just like too much power in the hands of one person. So he set a precedent on being a president. He set a template, and pretty much everyone followed it. Nobody ran for a third 4-year term. The first time it kind of came up, though, was Theodore Roosevelt. Take a look at President number 26. He was the vice president under McKinley, and McKinley was shot and killed like within months of his second term. So Roosevelt took over in early 1901 and then got elected in his own right in 1904. So he'd served almost 8 years. And then he followed Washington's precedent and didn't run again. William Howard Taft, number 27, was the president for 4 years. I guess who ran against him when he ran for re-election? Theodore Roosevelt. The previous president ran against the president. There were 3 major parties that year. Taft was the Republican. Theodore Roosevelt couldn't get the Republican nomination. He was the Bull Moose Party. We'll learn more about that. And then the Democratic candidate was Woodrow Wilson, and he won. So we almost had a president serve more than 2 full terms at that point. Ironically, The first president, see if you can figure this out. Raise your hand. Look at my board over here. Who was the first president to actually serve more than 8 years? He was not only elected once, twice, but elected for a third term that he completed, and he started a fourth term. He was elected to a fourth term, and he died partway early into his fourth term. If you look over at the board, you can actually see by the numbers. I'll give you a clue. It's in the second row to the bottom. Did you find it? I'll give you another clue. It wasn't Teddy Roosevelt. It was Franklin D. Roosevelt. Write it down. President number 32. Franklin D. Roosevelt ran for president in 1932 during the Great Depression. He ran again in 36. He's like, the Great Depression is still going on, and I'm trying to get some stuff done. 1940 comes along, and he's like, yeah, we still got some problems in the country. Plus, World War II had already gotten started over in Europe and in Asia. And he's like, I'm hearing from a lot of people that maybe they still want me as president. So I'll go ahead and run. Constitution didn't prohibit it. He ran, was reelected. And then in 1944, our country was in World War II. We were fighting Japan and Germany and Italy and da-da. And so he ran again. And he died in office. This is amazing. The man who served the longest time in the White House had a disability. He couldn't walk. Did you know that? As a young man, he got polio, which was a very debilitating thing that was pretty widespread in those days, and it took away his proper function of his lower extremities. So, I mean, he didn't like having his picture taken, wearing in a wheelchair or being assisted and so forth, because a lot of Americans are like, well, I don't think you can do the job. But guess what? I did the job pretty darn well, and he was elected at that time. Notice this. That's when the 22nd Amendment came in, so you can write that down. That was when Congress and most of the rest of the country is like, well, that should be a one-off. That should be like an exception. Let's not do that anymore. They didn't apply it to Harry Truman. He decided to just serve 2 terms. But ever since that time, here's the rule. Are you ready? No president can serve more than 10 years. We're like, but wait a minute. The terms are 4 years each. But the wording says 10 years. So you get these weird little kind of funky things that potentially could impact. So let's just say, for example, here's a hypothetical that I think you can follow. You ready? Joe Biden is president of the United States. He's serving a 4-year term. But let's say he dies or retires after 2 years and 1 month. So Harris would serve how long? No. As president, just under 2 years. If she ran for election in her own right, and she got it, 4 years, plus the previous 1 year and 11 months. Just under 6 years. Could she run and serve for another 4 years? Yes, if it came in just under 10 years. What happens, though, let's move it a little bit earlier, or a little bit later. What happens if she came as president after Joe Biden died or retired after a year and a half? She could run again for one full 4-year term. Could she run again for another full 4-year term? No, because that would put her over the 10-year limit. You got that? Does that make sense? Does it limit the number of years you can serve as vice president? No, but who cares about that? All right? Yeah. So do you got that? Does that make sense? So if you look there, I'll point out, Dwight D. Eisenhower, number 34, he served 2 4-year terms, so he served 8 years, couldn't run again. The next one that applied to Richard Nixon, was elected twice, and he could not serve, but he resigned partway through the end of it. Ronald Reagan served 8 years. Bill Clinton, 8 years. George W. Bush, 8 years. Barack Obama, 8 years. Donald Trump, 4 years. Could Donald Trump run again? If he wanted to, unless he was convicted by the United States Senate over the next week or so, and was ineligible to do that on a separate thing. All right, questions about that? Okay? All right. That's the 22nd Amendment. Washington wouldn't. Grant couldn't. Roosevelt shouldn't. I'm against a 3rd term. There we go. Let's see if we get into this. Are we really ready for that one yet? The lame duck. Oh, the lame duck amendment. Let's get into the lame duck amendment. That is like the lame one. Oh, yeah. The 20th Amendment. We're really up to that point yet? I don't think we're up to that point yet, are we? We're just double checking here. Yeah. Yeah, let's back it up here. Let's get to some generic stuff before we get to the lame duck. Sorry. All right. Election of the president and the vice president. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Election of the president and the vice president. Before we get to qualifications, that's coming up later on. Election of the president and the vice president. This actually takes a little bit of time to go through the electoral college system and so forth. Yes. All right. From the very beginning, we have had a president and a vice president elected. Okay. You ready? A president and a vice president. Which one is more powerful? The president. The president's going to have all kinds of various different powers, which we're going to get to. What are the powers of vice president? Michael, what is one of the powers of being vice president?
You're basically the president of the Senate.
Very good. And is that really powerful?
Not really.
Not really, because you really don't get to manage the debate and so forth. Like, and exactly. And when do you actually really have any power when you're in the Senate? Like when they're voting, do you actually get a vote? Except if, exactly, when there's a tie, then they get to participate. And Vice President Harris has already broken some tie votes already. So, I mean, they knew that because there's 50 Republicans, 50 Democrats. But other than that, the real power is going to be in the president. But let's go ahead and write this down as far as like how our presidential election system works. Yeah. I'll throw this in. Do you want to do this one, the lame duck? This one is like one of the weakest amendments and so forth. It's the 20th Amendment. It's like, who cares? The 20th Amendment. And it gives, I've got a little bit out of turn as far as the thing I've got in my slides here. It says that the president will take the oath of office on January 20th. Yeah, pretty much. Before, when did the president take the oath of office? In March. So you would elect a president like in November, and then you have to wait all the way until March. Well, in the early days of our country, where we didn't have air travel and we didn't have like paved roads hardly, it would take a while to get all that kind of coming together. And yeah, so they decided to, in the 20th Amendment, which came in 1933, let's have our country's president take the oath of office on January 20th. Does that make sense? Is that the most controversial thing ever? No, that's an easy one. That's why you look at these amendments, you're like, wow, that's not such a big deal. That's not very controversial. Let's just move up the inauguration date. Okay, some of them are going to be a little bit more important and more impactful, particularly when you get to how do we elect a president. All right, here we go. The election of the presidential system is very complicated. Write this down because you're going to need to have this. There's a lot of different component parts to this election system for the president. It's changed some since the early days. All right? First thing you need to write down is it is an indirect election system. It's an indirect election system. The voters elect electors, and those electors choose the president and the vice president. I'm not kidding. The voters, like me, I vote for an elector. And that elector picks the president. Okay? Which is really kind of weird. And actually, I'll explain it. In the early days of our country, it kind of worked out that way. The idea was, Other people in this country don't know enough about what's going on in other parts of the country. They just know who the smartest and brightest people are in their own state. So then they can just vote for the electors in their state, the really bright, smart, clever people, and then those guys will get together and then they'll pick a president. That was how it was supposed to work. And it was really simple. Hang on. It was really simple. In the very first and second election, everyone was pretty much like, well, I'm going to vote for you for elector because you're really clever and bright. And all those people got together. And it was like unanimous. Who was elected like unanimously for president of the United States with support from all over the entire country? Thank you very much. George Washington. Boom. George Washington, 1788. George Washington, 1792. Boom, boom. The early system, each elector got 2 votes. And the person, oh, is it really time again? The person who came in second place would become vice president, and that was John Adams. It'll get really weird. Actually, not really weird, but the third election turns out to be more like what we're familiar with. You elect electors not because they're clever, but because they tell you who they're going to support for when they actually do vote for president. Yeah.
Wait, so because Thomas Jefferson overturned that and said that
We had a constitutional amendment. We'll talk about that next time.
Oh.
And that was after the whole Hamilton-Burr thing. Yeah, in 1800. Yeah. So if you know the musical Hamilton, that'll help explain the 12th Amendment.
But like, it doesn't explain it, it just says that Jefferson said that, oh, we need to fix that, and then he overturned it. It doesn't really
He didn't so much. We'll get into the details of that. There was a lot of drama, and they made a great musical in that particular scene of that. After you wipe down, you guys can go tick off the 20th Amendment, and yeah, we're just getting started on that.
And a limbo.
Okay.
Outside.
Oh, yeah, I know. I kind of already know what all the arguments are, but I kind of already know what all the arguments are. Yeah.
Wait,
Yeah.
Mr. Nancy, can I ask a question?
You just did. Do you want the answer to another question?
Yes.
Yes.
Who do you think was the best president?
Oh, I thought Washington was a really good president. I liked a lot of the things that Lincoln did too. I put both of those guys way up there. So, yeah, how's that?
One.
What do you mean one?
You can only choose one.
Oh, I can choose one?
Yeah.
I'll go with Washington because he started it off just right.
That's it.
That's it?
Well, that's the only reason you like him.
No, there's a lot of reasons, but that's the reason.